Very good evening to all of you who are listening to this program from National Science Center. We are today celebrating the International Museums Day of the year 2020. It's a very strange time for all of us because we are all shut down in our offices or in our homes because of the COVID 19 pandemic. And we have been trying our best to create new programs, new exhibitions, new activities which our visitors can access even without coming to our centers, which we are hosting online and which is accessible to all our visitors. I'll be talking to some of our colleague curators from India and from around the world who will also be sharing their experiences with me today. The concept of inclusiveness is something that is inbuilt into the ethos of a museum. A museum is a place which needs to be accessible to everybody. It is a repository of common wealth, common heritage, which has to be accessed by all kinds of people, be they specially abled or be they poor, be they from different ethnic backgrounds, different linguistic backgrounds, different racial backgrounds. All these people need to be included in our definition of visitors so that our programs equally appeal to all of them and equally reach to all of them. It is with that idea that we are today having this program here. And before I initiate this discussion, I would request all the panelists to introduce themselves one by one.
Hello everyone, my name is Gretchen Jennings and I live in Washington, D.C. in the United States. I've worked in science, art, and history museums for almost 30 years, including about 20 years at the Smithsonian Institution. Since 2007, I've been an independent consultant. I served for a time as the editor of the Journal of the National Association for Museum Exhibition, and I've also published a number of articles and blog posts on the subject of inclusion in museums. I'm a founder of the Empathetic Museum Group, which you can find at empatheticmuseum.com, and we provide a rubric and specific directions for how to become a more inclusive, equitable, and diverse institution. I'd like to thank the National Council of Science Museums for inviting me to speak. Since 2009, I've had the privilege and the honor to travel to New Delhi, Calcutta, Mumbai, and a number of other Indian cities to offer classes and workshops on museum learning and exhibition development. And it's such a pleasure to speak with my colleagues and former students through this webinar. Finally, I'd like to say that I do not represent any official museum body in the United States. The comments that follow are my own opinions based on my experience and research over some 25 years.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Vinay Kumar Sahai, and I'm working as a Deputy Curator in Numismatics and Epigraphy and in charge of Central Asian Antiquities Collection, which is widely known as Oral Stein collection also in the world, which was brought around 120 years back from different Central Asian sites in China, and I'm also in charge of the conservation laboratory of National Museum. Apart from this, I'm also responsible as nodal officer for the digitization programs of National Museum. And yes, of course, I work for the National Museum, which is a subordinate office under the Ministry of Culture, government of India. I am really thankful to the host, National Council of Science Museums, for giving me this wonderful opportunity.
Hello everyone, my name is Susan Rakes. I'm Director of Learning for the Science Museum Group, which is a group of 5 science museums in the UK. We include the Science Museum in London and museums in the cities of York, Bradford and Manchester, and also a railway museum in County Durham. In total, we have around 6 million visitors to our museums every year. I'm responsible for all of our learning and education programmes, including events and activities for families, adults, educational groups. That includes 600,000 school children every year, and also our activities for access audiences. We also have a very large presence online, with a large resource bank of science activities for children of all ages, including games and apps, as well as experiments to try at home and in the classroom. We do a lot of training for teachers in the UK in our academy of how to use museum collections in science lessons, as well as training museum staff and scientists on how best to communicate their science to the public. One of our organisational values at the Science Museum Group is to be open for all. We take this extremely seriously and work very hard to remove barriers to accessing our buildings and the knowledge that we hold. This applies to everyone, of course, but for people with disabilities, this is crucial. We have adopted the social model of disability, which means that we focus on the barriers within society that disable people, rather than on individual differences or needs. And these barriers, of course, may be sensory or physical, intellectual or attitudinal. I'm very grateful to the National Science Centre Delhi and the National Council of Science Museums for the opportunity to take part in this important discussion. My special thanks to Mr. Iyer, Senior Curator of the National Science Centre, for holding the conversation.
Hello everyone, I'm Vinti Sen and I'm curator with the Nehru Memorial Museum, and we are situated in New Delhi, the national capital of India. I would like to convey my warmest greetings to NCSM and everyone who's at NCSM.
Namaste and good evening everyone. I am Bharat Bhushan Srivastava at National Science Centre, Delhi, working as Senior Education Officer. I am involved in developing various educational programs for youth, educators and families visiting the science centres. I am also involved in providing direction and support as needed by schools and teachers training colleges to supplement their classroom teaching to make their teaching learning process an enjoyable, enriching experience. I express my gratitude and regards to National Science Centre for providing me this platform to give my viewpoint on the subject, and a special thanks to Mr. Iyer for inviting me in the panel discussion on the occasion.
Thank you so much, participants. It's a pleasure having you all with us here today from different parts of the world. And this year's theme of the International Museums Day is Museums for Equality, Diversity and Inclusion. This is a particularly interesting theme and a very relevant theme for India, because India is an extremely diverse country. Demographically, geographically, socially, racially, ethnically, linguistically, and in many more ways, India is an extremely diverse country. In fact, it's aptly called a subcontinent because it contains all kinds of people. And museums in India need to be especially careful to include all kinds of people among its visitors. Our exhibitions and our activities need to be designed in such a way that they are appreciated by people of all backgrounds. And today we talk about the specially abled, visitors with special needs who come to our museums in large numbers throughout the year, and how we can make our museums more accessible to such special visitors so that they also find meaning in it, they also find value in our museums. Let me start by asking Dr. Gretchen Jennings from the USA. Dr. Jennings, what are the
Hello,
various
everyone.
accessible practices and initiatives that you use to improve accessibility to science museums across the United States for people with special needs?
In 1990, the Congress of the United States passed the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA. This legislation mandates, among other things, that public buildings and areas, and especially those receiving government funding, must make accommodations for people who have difficulties with mobility, who are blind, who are hearing impaired. And it's my experience that not only science museums, but almost all museums in the United States have the required ramps and elevators and accessible bathrooms at a minimum. And there are also guidelines for font and size of type and color and background for exhibition label copy. And not all museums follow this, but more and more of them are taking account of these kinds of accommodations, and they're also using them in online materials as well. Also, many museums provide sign language interpreters for public programs, and they also have subtitles for any videos that they produce. There's certainly always room for improvement, but I would say that the level of physical accessibility in U.S. museums relative to those in most countries of the world is quite high. One new development in U.S. museums is the attempt to make museums more accessible for children and adults with autism or other conditions where all of the sounds and the lights in museums can be too stimulating. Many museums now have early hours or separate hours or perhaps a separate space where the lights are dimmed and many of the sound producing interactives are turned off. And caregivers can bring people in for a museum experience that is much quieter and calmer and has lower sensual stimulation. I think in general, if museums follow the principle that they want to be comfortable and welcoming to all people, they'll continue to adapt all of their aspects, their physical spaces, their exhibitions, their programs, in order to make them more available to everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Jennings. That was so kind of you. Miss Rake, what are the programs that you organize for engaging people with disabilities, and how do you plan them at the Science Museum in London?
Across all 5 of our museums, having programmes that can be accessed by disabled people is vitally important to the Science Museum Group in our commitment to being open for all. This means that we are committed to ensuring that there are as few barriers for disabled people accessing our programmes as possible, and that everything we offer for the general public, we encourage visitors with disabilities to attend as well, and where we need to, we adapt what we are doing so that everyone can take part. Alongside this, though, we also do offer many special programmes for disabled people where we can cater exclusively for people's specific needs. Many of these are for people with sensory disabilities. So, for example, for deaf and hard of hearing visitors, we run special tours of museum galleries in British Sign Language. And we have a regular programme of inclusive events for families with members who are deaf, hard of hearing, or who use cochlear implants. Our presenters for those events use British Sign Language and are accompanied by voiceover interpreters and live subtitles, so these events are as accessible as they can possibly be. Alongside this, we have special days for families with members who are visually impaired, partially sighted or blind to enjoy events around the museum that are especially designed for them. And also, visually impaired, partially sighted or blind visitors can also have an audio-described tour of our most popular galleries with specially trained volunteer guides. Another example are our sensory astronights. Astronights are our regular family sleepovers at the Science Museum in London, where children and parents can spend the night at the museum doing lots of different activities and camping overnight in the museum galleries. Sensory Astronauts is a special version of the Sleepover, a relaxed, after-dark exploration of the Science Museum for children with special educational needs or disabilities. And to complement the late-night offer, we also have a special early morning offer called Early Birds, which is suitable for children who benefit from visiting the museum when it's much quieter than usual. For example, children with autism spectrum conditions or sensory processing differences, where families can explore the museum's galleries and take part in workshops especially designed for them. In terms of how we plan these activities, we do it all alongside our other learning programmes. We adapt our offer where we need to for different needs and provide access to the museum at different times or in different ways, but the processes of planning the content are the same as for our other programmes and are all done by our specially trained learning team.
Thank you, Ms. Rakes. We also have with us Mr. Bharat Bhushan Srivastav, who is a Senior Education Officer at the National Science Centre. And he has been instrumental in planning a lot of programs for specially able people, people with special needs. And let me ask Mr. Srivastav about his experiences. Mr. Srivastav, do you find that National Science Centre has been making an effort to make this center inclusive for all kinds of visitors? You had mentioned to me before that you would like to use some PowerPoint slides to make your point. You may use the slides and explain how you make the activities and the exhibits accessible to people with special needs.
Thank you, Mr. Iyer. I will use some slides. Diversity, equality, accessibility, and inclusion in all aspects of museum structure and programming are vital to the future viability, relevance, and sustainability of museums. You see here a group of students from a minority school of Delhi visiting the National Science Centre. Quality of being different or unique at individual or group level includes age, ethnicity, gender, language differences, nationality, parental status, physical, mental, and developmental abilities, race, religion, socio-economic status, education, work, and behavioral styles. The perspectives of each individual shaped by their nation, experiences, and culture. Even when people appear the same on the outside, they are different. This diversity is quite often seen in our visitors at National Science Centre. You see here a group of visually and physically challenged students visiting the National Science Centre. Diversity describes inclusiveness. Diversity always exists in social systems. Inclusion, on the other hand, must be created. In order to leverage diversity, an environment must be created where people feel supported, listened to, and able to do their personal best. You see here a group of children with special needs enjoying the facilities provided by the center. Science museums hold great promise for engaging learners of a broad range of abilities and disabilities in informal science learning because of interactive and self-directed activities, because of foster equitable learning environments for all, because of ability to present information and content in a variety of ways. You see here a group of defense personnel and a group of students from a minority school are interacting with our education staff, and on the other side, children with special needs are given individual attention. The overall outcome is expected to foster interest and curiosity among them. Science learning experiences in museums have been found to eliminate the performance differences that can exist in the classroom between the children with disabilities and those without disabilities. Here you see a group of special abled children and the normal children are enjoying the target exhibits, as we want to know their performance differences.
Excuse me, Mr. Srivastav, can I stop you for a minute, because Mr. Sahai is indicating that he needs to leave a little early. So let us come back to you later. In the meanwhile, Dr. Sahai, or a guest from the National Museum, can you tell us, sir, is there any gallery, especially at the National Museum, where children with special needs can visit and enjoy?
We have certain facilities or galleries which are especially dedicated to the people with disabilities, especially for the people who are having the impaired vision. So that gallery is made up of the replicas of museum artifacts, where one can go see or touch the artifacts depending on the conditions of the people. This gallery is especially meant for the vision impaired people. They are encouraged to touch the artifacts, have a feel of the artifacts, and there are guides who really explain the artifacts to the visitors, so that they can have an understanding, have a connection, have a bond with the artifacts, and they can really know something about the artifacts in details, and they can make a bond with the Indian artifacts in the gallery. Apart from this activity, there are other activities also which are time to time organized for the people having disabilities. Like suppose someone is having problem in moving in and around the galleries of National Museum, then they are provided the wheelchairs and proper assistance is given to them.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sahai. We also have with us Miss Vinti Sen from the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. They also organize a lot of programs and activities for people with special needs, especially the students, and it's a very popular location. The planetarium, the Nehru Planetarium at NMML, is a very popular location for students. And may I now ask Miss Vinti Sen about what is unique about your museum and who are your regular visitors?
The mandate of the museum is to showcase the life, the works, and the contributions of India's first Prime Minister, and to document, to archive the historical documents and the photographs, the documentaries associated with his lifetime. Just as is with any great leader, you cannot really portray them in isolation. Therefore, the museum has very judiciously, portrayed his entire lifespan, his entire life work, and amidst the freedom struggle, in the background of the freedom struggle, the long freedom struggle of India from 18th century until India became became a republic in 1950. So his contemporaries, his important predecessors, all find a place in our display, be it stalwarts like Tilak, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Gopal Krishna Gokhale, Mahatma Gandhi, who was his guru in the politics, and Sardar Patel, B.R. Dr. Ambedkar. So all these contemporaries and his predecessors and the important contributions, they all find a place in the museum. There are a lot of historical photographs, very rare historical photographs that form part of our display. And apart from these photographs, we have a lot of original writings and original letters, original documents by these stalwarts, and along with a lot of archives, along with a lot of microfilms and the newsreels, a lot of historical display. It plays a very important part in how you are going to sort of chalk out your programs, or how you are going to create the historical photographs, the documentaries, the archival material that we have. That's all about, let's say, no less than 50 years prior to this generation. So how does it become relevant to them? So that was one of the major briefs that was given to me. And also then that's also how I propose that we should become from more instruction oriented to more communication oriented museum, because if you're able to achieve that, I think you can inch closer towards calling yourself a more inclusive museum. So we tackled this in two ways. We did very extensive visitor studies. We had to know who our visitors were. So for us, after studying the footfalls and studying from previous data, whatever little data we had, it emerged that school groups and family groups and tourists, these were the three major segments that were visiting the Nehru Memorial Museum.
Thank you, Ms. Sen. Dr. Jennings, what do we really mean when we say that museums are inclusive?
Museums are microcosms of the world around us. They're ecosystems with their own governments, hierarchies, policies, and practices that mirror much of our society at large. It's not possible to think about museums during these intense times without reflecting on the context of the social, cultural, and political climate. In the United States, museums at this time use the acronym DEAI to refer to diversity, equity, accessibility, and inclusion. And you can find these descriptions and examples and definitions for each of these qualities on the websites of the American Alliance of Museums, AAM, or the Association of Science Technology Centers, ASTEC. Both of these organizations have developed training sessions and workbooks to encourage museums to become more culturally and racially inclusive. So far, in my view, none of this DEAI work, which has been going on for over 25 years, has been very successful. For me, inclusion means that a museum is fully representative of the diversity of people within a nation in its leadership, its staffing, its exhibitions and programs, and in its audience. Everything about the museum says to its audience, "We are like you and we are here for you." Unfortunately, this is not the case with most American museums. Both in science centers and other types of U.S. museums, the vast majority of directors and board members are white men. There are very few women or individuals who are African American, Latinx, Asian American, or Native American. Very few of these are in senior positions. And this is also true of professional staff positions such as curators, exhibit developers, or educators. There are certainly more women in the education field, but again, very few minorities or people of color. My view is that the U.S. museum system as a collective, that is, individual museums, as well as our associations and our museum culture, is a place of white perspectives and white privilege. This is because our field is dominated and shaped by white leadership in which people of color have little representation, despite the powerful voices of our too few colleagues of color. How is it, you might ask, that American museums have been working on diversity issues for years, but have seen little change? I think one of the reasons is that there have been many initiatives and attempts, but almost all of them are very individual. They're siloed within one or two departments of a museum, and often they are one-off. They are not long-term and sustainable. For example, many museums hire a person of color to be a community coordinator, and they may hire that person to promote a single exhibition, for example, about black scientists or Latinx artists. But then once that exhibition goes away, there's not a lot for the community coordinator to really promote because the museum itself has not really changed. There are also diversity fellowships within museums where a young person who wants to be a curator or an exhibit developer may be assigned as a fellow within a department, and really it's very beneficial for that person, but because they are new, they're temporary, they don't have a lot of power in the department, generally they don't make a lasting change in the department. You have, as I mentioned, temporary exhibitions on the achievements or the art of people of color, and these efforts, while well-intentioned, generally don't have a lasting impact. So the conclusion that I come to, and also many of my colleagues who work in this area, is that it's not that museums have been unaware of the continuing lack of diversity and inclusion. Instead, the profession has yet to grasp the systemic nature of the problem, which is untreatable by disparate initiatives. The failure to become more inclusive lies in the field's inattention to the intersectional or the multidimensional roots of exclusion, and these are interrelated conditions of racism, sexism, elitism, colonialism, and white privilege. Until museums really examine these within their own walls, they are really not going to be internally transformed, and therefore they are not going to be fully inclusive.
Wonderful, Dr. Jennings. Now, Miss Rakes, you are from the Science Museum in London, which I had the good fortune to visit some time back, but I missed visiting your section. So let me ask you, do you have any universal design principles for exhibits and activities that you create specially for people with special needs?
Alongside programming events and activities for visitors with disabilities, it's vitally important to the Science Museum Group that the design of our buildings, our exhibitions and our individual exhibits do not put up unnecessary barriers for disabled people. We have a set of guidelines for lots of different areas of our work in the Science Museum Group so that we can check and ensure that we are following accessibility best practice. We work with professional access consultants who check what we do and make sure that it is good as it can possibly be. And also we arrange consultation panels with local disabled people who comment on our ideas and help support us to be even more accessible in what we do. This means that at the design stage of everything, whether that's an entire new suite of galleries or a single exhibit or a facility like the cafes or the toilets in the museums, we think about how to make those things as accessible as we possibly can. A lot of those requirements are relatively simple physical things we're all familiar with, such as ramps, lifts and wide doorways for wheelchair access or providing accessible toilets. Others are maybe less obvious, such as the colour contrast on a museum map, or the size of label text, and providing subtitles and British Sign Language translation on videos and our online content. We also think carefully about lighting and sound. For visitors with visual impairments, bright light can be essential to maximise vision, but on the other hand, too much light or sound can be very off-putting for people with autism spectrum disorder, so it's very important to balance different people's needs and think about ways to be able to have different areas which are brighter or darker, louder or quieter. We also make sure that we install as much seating as possible and have rest spaces away from the busy galleries for anyone who needs to take a break. Another very important point for us is about representation. This is an issue for science museums in lots of different areas, showing women in science or people of different ethnicities, for example, but even more so for disabled people. We think very much about this in our design and photography and in the stories that we tell, so that we can show that there is a place in science for all people.
That's a very relevant point that you made, Miss Rakes, that there is a place in science for all people. We at the National Science Center also believe that science belongs to everybody and there is a place in science for all people. I once again apologize for having interrupted Mr. Srivastav while he was making his very interesting presentation. Mr. Srivastav, can you continue? And I'll be very happy if you can tell us whether you also adopt this principle of there being a place in science for all people. Yes, you may use slides.
Thank you, Mr. Iyer. Today, science museums around the world take intentional, meaningful, and repeated actions to be more inclusive of visitors with a broad range of diversities. An initiative to address inclusion of the aging population, including the senior citizens from old age home, is being taken by National Science Center, Delhi. You know, Mr. Iyer, in late 1990s, focused on physical aspect of inclusion, such as height and reach of exhibits and accessibility of physical museum building. Today, inclusion has a more multidimensional meaning. In the slide here, you see that our center organizes various activities and contests for achieving goal-oriented outcome. Inclusion now also encompasses ways to cognitively engage all visitors in learning about science and ways to enable all visitors to interact socially with others in their visiting groups. Children of slum dwellers, sex workers, rag pickers visit National Science Center Delhi and understand the importance of being scientifically aware for improving their conditions. We are taking action to create a learning environment both in physically sense and cognitively inclusive. Recently, a visit for a group of cancer patients, mostly children, was organized. The visit was made possible with the help of an NGO engaged in spreading awareness on the causes of cancer disease, prevention and treatment. What you see is the picture of their visit. In my next slide, you will find Anganwadi workers, minority schools, madrasas, and children from special schools remain our regular visitors now. I would like to conclude in this slide and would like to say, as more and more science museums adopt inclusive practices, I can imagine a time when it is commonplace to present information in multiple formats, not just with text labels, but also with audio images and video, to offer multi-sensory interactives and to provide scaffolding and support that aid all visitors in learning about science. With this, I conclude, and once again, I express my sincere thanks to the organizers and a special thanks to Mr. Iyer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Srivastav. That was a very interesting presentation by you. Ms. Sen, can you now tell us how NMML brings inclusiveness into their programs?
We've tried and made ourselves more inclusive. Another very important step another thing that we did realize through our visitor studies, and that a lot of the tourist groups, they're coming from, I'll be talking more about the domestic tourist groups coming from different regions of India, where they were, requested for multilingual representations, or the versions of. They were not so well versed with English and Hindi, and so another very proactive step that we took was to expand our guiding team, and we deliberately hired, very consciously hired people who could speak multiple languages, and that's been a very major step in making the museum, a little more inclusive. I'm glad to share that the Nehru Memorial Museum is presently going through a very extensive upgradation program, which includes a lot of civil repairs, which includes, upgrading the facilities, the basic amenities that we have presently, and also the entire display of the museum. It's going to completely get revamped. The 10 galleries, the permanent galleries that we have on the 2 floors, those will be revamped. So, when we talk about people with special needs and what provisions we could think of, or what we are planning to implement, they're basically at 2 levels. One is to ensure that they have comfortable accessibility within the premises in a very dignified way, and even with respect to our display, how can we make our display more accessible and more user-friendly for these people? So the upgradation project, when it got initiated, we worked very closely with our architect, the design consultant, and we made it known that there are a lot of staircases in the museum building. The lift is quite small. It does not provision for a free movement or a free space movement. So those are the very basic things that we needed to cater to. So we went to a lot of places and museums, and what we picked from there was, very important things we needed to implement and immediately implement those. The parking spaces for people with special needs had to be, very close to the main entrance, no further than 30 meters, or the lift had to give them about 900 to 1200 of free space movement. There should be handrails, the grab rails. So all these things, we sort of have included, and these have come into place, and they're very much now, they have been executed in the museum building. Mind you, we are a grade 1 heritage building, so we cannot by that way make way too many structural changes to the historical building. How we can make the display more accessible, whether it's people for, when we talk about accessibility, it's not only about physical accessibility, it's also about people with low visions. How do we cater to their needs? So, with raised alphabets, induction loops, audio induction loops, photo captioning, with sounds. So those are the things that we have very proactively included in in the display that we'll be taking up.
By the way, Ms. Rakes, can you briefly tell me what percentage of the people who visit your museums are those with special needs?
In the UK, we know that around 18% of the British population classes themselves as having a disability. On average, only around 6% of visitors to the Science Museum Group museums have a disability, so we know that there is more that we need to do to ensure that we remove as many barriers as possible so that all disabled people could visit us if they chose to. In terms of inclusiveness, though, we do not limit our definition only to disability, important though that is. As we are committed to being open for all, we want to ensure that everyone feels that science is for them and feels welcome and comfortable at our museums. This includes people from lower socioeconomic groups and people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic communities who do not currently make up very large numbers of our visitors or of our staff. Our aim is that our visitors and our staff equally represent all the different people we find in the local communities around our 5 different museums. We use a concept called science capital to think about how we do this. Science capital is a measure of someone's engagement or relationship with science, how much they value it and how much they feel it is for them and connected to their life. One of the important elements of this is to widen perceptions of who does science by highlighting the diversity of people who use science in their work, how science is not just for scientists, and that our visitors are and can be scientists and have a good relationship with science regardless of their background or their abilities.
Dr. Jennings, you had mentioned earlier in your introduction that you have visited many museums in India, and of course you have visited many museums in the US also. The United States, like India, is also a very diverse country in many ways. Do you find any difference between the science museums in India and USA in terms of diversity and inclusiveness?
I don't really feel qualified to make a judgment on the level of diversity in science museums in India. I would just say that if they're like museums in the United States, then they're not very diverse or inclusive. In the United States, museums of all kinds have been shaped by U.S. history, which is steeped in racism and white privilege. American museums tend to be run by people from the most privileged classes. The collections and topics of exhibitions are often shaped by the views of this privileged group. The boards of directors and the people hired also come primarily from this group, and all kinds of statistics which are contained in some of the articles that I'm going to be sharing illustrate that this is true. Until museums understand this monolithic perspective and work to change it, external efforts such as creating an occasional exhibition about people of color do not really make museums institutionally inclusive. In India, from what I have observed in the 5 or 6 times that I have visited, there could certainly be more women involved in the highest levels of museum direction and curation. When I taught in the National Council of Science Museums Museum Study Program in Calcutta, I had a number of outstanding women students in almost every class. Very few of them ended up in museum positions, and I see this as a loss for the science museum field in India. I think the key for measuring museum diversity and inclusion in any society is to look at who is historically privileged in that society. Are museum directors, curators, and other staff drawn almost exclusively from that group, whether it is based on race, gender, caste, class, religion, or some other measure of privilege? If that's the case, then in order to become inclusive, museums must think about how to break through and change the system which results in a monolithic institution. In India, you know better than any outsider, such as myself, what those systems of privilege are, and so you must make the assessments and decisions about how you want to change those.
This is a digital society, and as I mentioned right in the beginning, even this program is going online. We would normally have, as we do on all years, conducted this program as a panel discussion in an auditorium full of students and visitors. But the digital platform is coming into society in a very big way, and we are trying to recast ourselves, mold ourselves in a way in which our programs, our exhibitions, our activities become relevant to the digital platform. so as to attract younger people too. May I now ask Dr. Sahai, who has been working for quite some time at one of the most prestigious museums of India, the National Museum, as to what they are doing to make the museum more inclusive in this digital age.
I'm having the responsibility of digitization project of National Museum. There are certain things which are doing at the museum to encourage people to know about the National Museum by just not only visiting the museum but also from the comforts of their houses. They can log into a portal where the artifacts of National Museum are hosted. It's called Museums of India, and on that portal 10 major museums of India are hosting their artifacts, and National Museum is one of them, which shares its artifacts on that platform. This digitization project is in a nutshell called as Jatan project, which we are doing with the help of CDAC, Pune, and there we are very recently having some different kinds of project also coming up. That is called the mobile app. So on mobile app also one can access the collection of National Museum, and this is, yes, of course going to be launched, but app has been made and is going through the security audit so that all the formalities are properly done, properly maintained, and people can really enjoy the artifacts on their smartphones or their Android phones, iPhones, etc., and view the artifacts of National Museum and get connected to the Indian art, Indian culture, and understand it from the confines of their homes, confines of their offices in their leisure time.
Ms. Rakes, we have all been, as I can see, working quite hard, quite eagerly to include visitors with special needs into our programs and activities. But what are their expectations from our museums? Have you in your museum done any specific study on this, on the learning outcomes of people with special needs, and whether our exhibitions and activities are serving these special needs? Can you tell us a little about this?
The Science Museum Group is very committed to audience research in many different forms. Before, during and after our projects, we consult with our audiences on what we should do, how we should do it, and how well we did. Much of this research, along with many participation and consultation projects, concerns how successful our disabled visitors feel our work is. We have far more examples of this than I have time to discuss here, but very briefly, for our new Science City Gallery, which opened last year at the Science Museum in London, we ran a project with young people aged 15 to 25 who had learning disabilities. Learning outcomes for the project included participants gaining craft and making skills and also employability skills. The evaluation study showed that young people viewed the project positively and would be keen to work with the museum again. They felt they had ownership over the project and they were proud of what they had achieved. For the development of the new medicine galleries at the Science Museum in London, 3 projects were undertaken in partnership with people with disabilities. The outputs of the projects were a film created in partnership with people with acquired brain injury, audio testimonies exploring the question of what is normal, created in partnership with a panel of people with mixed disabilities, and a set of films created in partnership with people with experience of mental ill health. Evaluation with project participants found that participants in all the projects felt that they had been given an opportunity to connect with others. They enjoyed meeting the new people, hearing their stories and sharing their own experiences. Many said that connecting with others had helped them to learn new things about, for example, their own medical condition. Multiple participants stated that being involved in the project had increased their self-confidence. We've also carried out a lot of research on our programs for disabled people, including the scientific program of deaf-led family events and the early bird sessions for families with children who have autism. These studies showed that the participants very much enjoyed the activities and valued the opportunity to experience the museum in circumstances that suited their needs.
That's interesting, Ms. Rakes. Professor Jennings, what are the various standard evaluation procedures available in science museums and science centers to study about the learning outcome of visiting people with special needs?
I'd like to address the question about evaluation by discussing two projects related to inclusion in U.S. science centers. They were both directed at deep systemic change, the kind of change that I've been talking about. The first is called Youth Alive. It's quite an old program. It was begun in 1990, and a number of you that have attended Aztec conferences, for example, may have seen sessions and panels on this program. It was launched by Aztec with outside support. They had quite generous funding, and the purpose was to bring opportunities for education and personal growth to children of color and those from low-income communities. Students were trained to become facilitators and to serve in other visitor-serving positions. In 2001, after the funding had run out, Aztec reported that about 7,000 youth had been served. Yet a 2010 study reported these remarkable outcomes. 44 of the 77 institutions that had received funds to establish Youth Alive programs still had Youth Alive programs 10 years later, even without the funding. And an additional 119 institutions that never received any Youth Alive funding also had developed special programs for youth. So this program went so well that it was copied and retained even after funding ran out. And there's more good news. In looking at the diversity statistics in a workforce survey published by Aztec and also by the Association of Children's Museum in 2011, the only job groupings in the United States that very closely parallel the racial and ethnic makeup of the U.S. population today are the floor staff and floor manager positions, which were the ones that were nourished and promoted by the Youth Alive project. When we see that one of the principal requirements for receiving a Youth Alive grant was that the museum had to commit to integrating participants into the fabric of the entire institution, it doesn't seem accidental that the greatest strides in diversity appear in a cohort on which there was systemic and focused attention for 10 years, such that 10 years later this diverse engagement persisted. A second program is called Making Connections, and it is sponsored or was sponsored by the Science Museum of Minnesota. I'll again leave information about this program, but you can Google Making Connections Science Museum of Minnesota and find the report that they produced. This was a research project conducted by the Science Museum. In the U.S., over the past several years, something called the Maker Movement has become very popular, and I'm not sure if this is worldwide or only in the United States, and it's not limited to museums. Instead, all over the country there are maker fairs where people of all ages come together to make things with their hands, to tinker and invent. And of course the ideas behind the Maker Movement are very compatible with all of the hands-on rooms that exist in science centers and children's museums in the United States. And I also know that many science centers in India have created hands-on labs for invention and innovation. However, in the United States, the Maker Movement is very homogeneous, with a primarily white male, and middle to upper middle class following. The Science Museum of Minnesota recognized that they needed to work on their relationship with the many communities of color and also the American Indian community in the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area where the Science Museum is located. There are also a large number of immigrants from Southeast Asia, for example, the Hmong people. So the Science Museum sought to develop a more intentional relationship with family groups who identified with these groups who were not primarily white and middle class. Making Connections was an applied research project that developed maker programs with these designated groups of people, and they did it with the groups. They sought out community representatives and made sure that they had a lot of input into the development of the programs. Together with these communities, the Science Museum developed maker activities that were more appropriate, more integrated into these cultures, not so much robots and various engineering tasks, but maker projects that involved art and textiles and other activities that were integral to these communities. The report on Making Connections spells out both the successes and the challenges that were faced by the Science Museum in completing this project. I was an editor of this report, and one of the things I noticed was that the Science Museum itself had to make a number of changes internally to adapt to really welcoming and making comfortable the groups of people that they wanted to work with. So it had a tremendous impact on the protocols and staffing procedures, scheduling, many aspects of the museum's infrastructure were affected as they tried to make this program successful. So I think many of you would find this report really interesting.
Dr. Sahai, in the current scenario of lockdown in India and in most parts of the world, how can people avail of the facilities of the National Museum? Have you digitized any exhibition? Are there any online activities that you conduct? Are there any online lectures that are available which all people can access during these times of the lockdown?
During the current crisis time, there are other steps also being taken up by National Museum, where we are putting up digitized exhibition on the website of National Museum and on different platforms. 2 exhibitions have been already launched on the website of National Museum, and others are in the pipeline. So this troubled time has really helped us to look not only the orthodox method of reaching out to public, but something which was not earlier thought about. So these are some of the steps which we are right now taking up to really get connected to the public at large, to really get connected to the connoisseurs of Indian art, so that they want to connect to the museums. They can easily get connected to the National Museum in New Delhi.
I think we have had a wonderful discussion here today and we gained a lot from this. It was personally a learning experience for me. I have also been working in this field for quite some time, and it is a matter of particular interest, something very close to my heart, that the exhibitions and activities that we make and do. As a curator, I personally desire that it reaches a maximum number of audience, and inclusiveness is a must for this. So after having heard from all of you, I find that we all think very similarly, whether we are in India or abroad, and this encourages me to keep working in this direction. This encourages us all at the National Council of Science Museums to keep working towards making inclusiveness a basic ingredient in the design of exhibitions and activities for our visitors. I now request Dr. Jennings to give her concluding remarks. And Dr. Jennings, you were mentioning that you had a slide that you wanted to show. So you can now show the slide and you can make your concluding remarks. Dr. Jennings.
In conclusion, I'd like to share a quotation from Joanne Jones-Rizzi, my co-author for the Dimensions article. For those of us who are not white, male, English-speaking, educated, heterosexual, or who have a disability or do not have class privilege or gender normative identities, it is often hard to find our voice within the majority of U.S. museums. Yet, we turn to museums in the hope that we will find a perspective through which we can view the world around us. We anticipate that we will discover how others might think, learn with others in the dynamic social environments that museums can generate, and feel affirmed when we see our perspectives represented and voiced. To me, this quotation sums up the goal of inclusiveness in museums. It's to really guarantee that all people who visit will feel at home, will feel welcome, will feel that they can learn, will feel that they can bring their families and their friends, and that they would want to come back. Once again, I'm so happy to have been part of this project, this webinar. Greetings to all my friends and colleagues in India, and please stay safe and healthy during this time of the pandemic.
So we conclude this panel discussion here, and I hope we'll all be able to get together and talk about this subject in much greater detail, maybe a few months from now once again. And the idea of inclusiveness may, to some people, appear a little too idealistic. Maybe curators in their enthusiasm, education officers in their enthusiasm, make exhibitions and activities in a way that they are available to people, but people with special needs see our exhibitions and activities in a totally different way. How we can make ourselves more relevant to such visitors who must matter a lot to us is something that we need to make a deeper study on, and today's discussion has started off in a wonderful way, and I'm sure we'll all be able to work on the lessons that we have learned today, build on the lessons that we have learned today, and meet once again in a short while to discuss the progress that we make. Let me thank you all once again and wish you all a wonderful International Museums Day. Thank you.